Hello, welcome to the New South Wales SACS Education and Information Workshop. This is a program that's run by the National Disability Services, ACOSS and Jobs Australia as a joint program, and it's funded by the Australian Government. Okay, today I'm going to talk about the transition to the award, in particular the transition timetables, penalties and loadings, some other conditions, the modern award review, at least through till November 2012, some implementation issues, as well as the equal remuneration order and its implementation, pay rates, and also the industrial obligations around funding. Moving quickly along, the transitional timetable from SACS New South Wales to SCHADS was a little bit changed due to the ERO implementation, but basically what's happened is at 1 July last year, we moved the classifications across, so that should be done by now. Everyone should be on top of that. The pay rates, including the ERO, will be phased in from July 2012 through till December 2020. So what that does mean is that any transitional rates or phasing, all this sort of, all the work we've been doing will be happening right through till 2020. So if you make a new position in December 2019, you will need to classify that under the old award and under the model award and work out what the transitional rate will be. Penalty rates and loadings will be phased from July 2012 through till July 2014. So by July next year, that phasing will have ended and will be right through to the modern award, and the only parts of the modern award we'll still be looking at will be those pay rates in terms of classifications. Allowances moved at July 2010, and other conditions also moved at July 2010. In terms of redundancy and severance, some provisions of that are preserved through to July 2014, and so if you're going to make, or you're looking to make people redundant or to restructure, you might need to have a look at the old award to make sure that you're paying the higher of the two. Just a quick example of how the Shiploadings Phase. It's relatively simple in New South Wales. For example, the loading pre-July 2012 was 15%, and it's moving to 12.5% next year. So there's a phasing of 40% in the difference. Now this is because it was put on hold. So all other awards phase are 20% increments per year. And because of the ERO, the SACS award is going to move suddenly, basically by 3 increments. So we'll move to 40% of the difference, meaning in this instance that it's a 13.5% loading as of July 2012, and it'll phase down to 20% of the difference this year, and we'll move to 13%. That is subject to maintaining take-home pay. The thing to remember about take-home pay is you don't need to find where the shortfall might have come in. You just need to make sure that the dollar value at the end of the week is the same. So if someone moves shifts, for example, that's not something you need to make up in terms of take-home pay. So it really is only about exactly the same shifts and what someone takes home at the end of the week. Just a bit of a review of the shift penalty changes from SACS New South Wales to the SCHADS award. Not hugely different for part-time and full-time workers. As you'll see, there's a move in the afternoon shift from 15% to 12.5%, from night shift from 30% to 15%. That might be where we have a bit more of an impact. Public holidays remain the same, Saturdays remain the same, and Sundays move by 25% up to 100%. Certainly one of the things to remember about all these things is that there's no need for you to phase if you want to maintain a higher penalty for your workers. That certainly will be up to you and what your funding arrangements allow. There's no problem with paying more than these minimums if you would like to, but that certainly is up to you as an organisation. Again, you have to be a bit careful about reduction in take-home pay. Probably not going to be a huge impact in the case of shift workers because it is offset by things like the CPI or minimum wage increases. If we have a look at the casuals, that's where you might see a bit more of an impact in terms of take-home pay. As you can see, there is a phasing from 24.58% up to 25%. Most organisations probably already paying 25%, but everything phases, so even that small percentage still phase through. Where you see the big impact there is the Saturday and Sunday loadings. Now we are awaiting the outcome of the modern award review, so there could be changes to that, but at this point in time, we're looking at phasing down from 50% and 75% to 0 on Saturdays and Sundays. that is subject to take-home pay. So if you have someone who's a casual who only works Saturdays and Sundays, you might find that they might be subject to the take-home pay orders. But the thing to remember is that anyone who's working every Saturday and every Sunday really should be a part-time staff member anyway, so that might be more your concern in the case of those particular workers. There's also nothing to stop you, of course, maintaining those allowances if you would like to, but again, that's going to be subject to whether or not you can afford it, really. So the Modern Award Review, this is the outcome of November 2012. So really the reason these things came through so quickly was because all parties were fairly consistent in their interpretation of these parts of the award. There was a clarification that the 4-hour minimum engagement does not preclude work on both sides. So you can work both sides of a sleepover. You just must work at least a 4-hour block on one side or the other. You can certainly work 4 hours on both sides. You could work 6 hours on one side, 2 hours on the other. The award certainly doesn't stop you from doing that. Employers, in addition, there was one small change, which is that employers and employees may agree to reduce the break between shifts from 10 hours to 8 hours where it's associated with a sleepover. So this is only in cases where there's a break and there's a sleepover on one side or the other. And it has to be by agreement, and I suggest that maybe that agreement should be in writing, or there should be some notification of to employees that if they disagree, they can certainly disagree and ask for the 10-hour break rather than the 8-hour break. So a memo, an email, something in writing so that employees understand that it's their right to choose to have a 10-hour break if they wish, or that they can engage in this 8-hour arrangement with you. Other changes. Now you notice that most of these are about clarification of the award. The Modern Award Reviews were set up as a clarification, with the idea of being a clarification of the award, not a chance to change the award. So they are quite small changes. In some cases, they're just clarifications. There was a note added to the definition of home care workers, and basically what it was doing is to ensure that there was an understanding that a worker was not a home care worker just because they do work in a home. Certainly we'd all be aware that there will be social and community services work that happens in the home as well. It does not become home care work just because it's being done in the home. It may still be SACS work. A couple of other small changes. Loadings payable for broken shifts are determined by the time of the end of the shift. So if you have 3 hours and then a large break and then another 4 hours at the end, when that 4 hours ends at the other end, that's going to let you know what sort of shift it is, and that will be paid for the entire shift. So if you've got 7 hours worth of work, then 7 hours will be at that shift provision. So just remember, with the exception of weekends and public holidays, that shifts are defined and only have one allowance. You don't break them up. 24-hour care provisions only apply to home care workers. Again, that was just another clarification. It shouldn't be seen as anything particularly different at this point. There are a few other issues that are still up in the air. They will need to be determined by a commissioner. Some issues around part-time employment, certainly move from casual to part-time employment will be part of that. Small employer redundancies. Some awards previously have had small employer redundancy in them, and there's been an application to put that back into the modern award. Some further discussion of broken shifts, casual penalty rates, so those Saturday and Sunday rates, annual leave and public holidays. So we should see an answer to that at some point later this year. Certainly there have been a few implementation issues around this. Certainly the rostering arrangements have been problematic, and hopefully that move from having a 10-hour break between those sleepover shifts to the ability to have an 8-hour shift might make it easier for rostering. Certainly one of the big issues has been long-term casuals and part-time employment. Where you have long-term casuals who want to stay long-term but are actually part-time, you are carrying a liability with those workers because they may make an application and be successful in an application to have their annual leave paid. So the argument that a casual is a casual simply because they're called that and paid that unfortunately doesn't work. If they're regular and systematic, they are in fact part-time employees, and you might need to have a look into how that works. There's also been some discussion around job design and classifications, and having had this opportunity to review all classifications has certainly given us the chance to review how we design our jobs, and also to have a look at the way we work around classifications. For example, in a situation where you might have higher duties shared around certain employees, we need to be careful that that's not creating an opportunity for those workers to be classified upper level, where you might need to look at redesigning the way that kind of work is distributed to ensure that we're not creating an entitlement for employees to be at a higher level where they're not really performing those duties. Moving on to the ERO implementation. The modern award rates will increase by between 23 and 45%. Remember, those are the modern award rates, not the transitional rates, which are treated a bit differently. That does include the 4% increase for barriers to bargaining. So if you hear anything about a 4%, it doesn't need to be added at the start. It doesn't need to be added as we go along. It is included in that 23 to 45%, so that's not a concern. The full amount will be payable by December 2020. So we'll be doing this through till December 2020. It's phased in by 9 equal instalments each December. So for the purposes of budgeting, you can use what the percentage increases that people saw were as a guideline, although it's never going to be exact. Pay rates are affected by transitional arrangements moving from old awards to SCHADS, and that's where we come across the difficulties in New South Wales. Okay, where the old rates are maintained as transitional award rates if they are higher than the modern award. So that's going to be the case for most employees in New South Wales. They're going to see a maintained transitional above award rate. Now the important thing is to think about these rates as transitional award rates, not as above award rates. If you consider them as above award rates, there might be some confusion. They're transitional award rates and they need to be treated as such. If they're lower, we move directly to the modern award. The transitional rates increase at a slower rate than the modern award rates to get to the same place in 2020. So those transitional rates are going to remain above award through until above the modern award rate through to 2020 when they will reach the same point. So looking at how that's calculated, where A equals the equal remuneration payment, or where we'll be in 2020. So that's going to change every year due to the CPI increases or federal minimum wage increases. Where B equals the award rate, or where we are now, either the modern award rate or the preserved transitional award payment. Each December we add 1/9 of the difference between the two. So we get the current rate for an employee, we take that away from where we'll be in 2020 and add 1/9. Of course that needs to be recalculated every year to take into account CPI increases. So this year we'll see 2 nights, next year 3 nights, etc., etc. This is just a bar graph to give you a bit of a look at how that looks practically. So where A equals the ERO payment, so that's going to change every year in 2020. Where B equals the current modern award rate, we take away B from A, and we divide it by 9 and add 1/9. So there you can see what it looks like. Where we have a preserved above modern award rate, so we can see a different situation there, and that's going to be the situation for most workers in New South Wales. We take away B from A, and we add 1/9 of the difference. So there, as you can see, someone on a current preserved above modern award rate is always going to remain above the person on the modern award rate. They're going to see increases every year, all the same. That increase is just going to be smaller. This is what it looks like as a graph. As you can see, both lines are going to the same place in 2020. The bottom, or darker green line there, is the modern award. The one above it is the transitional rate. So as you can see, it's a bit bumpy because it changes every year because of CPI, which is why we can't necessarily tell you what the increase exactly will be every year, but they do go to the same place in 2020. All right, so this is what they look like. So you'll see there in the fourth column, that's the highest increase anyone would see, and that would only be for people on the modern award. Where we see people on SACS New South Wales transitional rates, you'll notice that they're much lower. For example, at the level 3, you'll see that it's possible that some employees would have seen 0.8% of an increase. That's why the increases might be significantly lower than what you might have been expecting, is because those transitional rates are not nearly as high in terms of the increases per year. It's important to remember that these are just guesstimates at this point in time, and they might change because of the CPI increases. So they might do for you approximating your budgeting, but it's not going to be exact. The good news is that you can get pay tables online, so you can get those from NDS's web page. So we can have a look there for Jobs Australia pay tables, and you'll be able to get those for a little while. They present the most likely translations together with the applicable pay rate, the modern award rate or the transitional award rate. So if you have unusual translations, you might need to get a bit of help with that, either working it out for yourself, having a look online at the Ombudsman's website, or even contacting your employer organisation to have a chat with them about how you might deal with an unusual translation. This is what a Jobs Australia pay table looks like. As you can see, you go to the first column and you find where your worker was previously classified. You go to the second column and match them up to where they are now to find their salary. You'll notice that each level occurs twice in the first column. That's because you need to match it up with the second column. So for example, where you see community services worker grade 2 and it occurs twice, if you go across, one lot is for where they've gone to a level 2 under the modern award, and one is for where they've gone to a level 3 under the modern award. So you do need to match up with both with the correct levels. If you try to do it from the modern award backwards to the SACS award, you're going to have a bit of a struggle. So go to the first column, then to the second column, and you can find out how much people need to be paid. This is what the Fair Work Ombudsman's website looks like. So they have a calculator, and it can be a useful tool for you. I do suggest that you don't rely on it solely to do your translations, because certainly we're all open to making mistakes. So if you are using this, I do suggest that perhaps it's better to have a look at your own translations and have a go at it yourself, and then try and cross-match it with the calculator to try and see if you can work out what it should be. But certainly if you've got pay tables, that should work the majority of the time. The equal remuneration calculator may not help you with unusual translations either. That may also cause you some troubles. That's what it looks like when you actually go in and have a look at it. Different translations are possible but unlikely, so that's why they're not on the whole represented through that. Usually it comes from overclassification under the SACS New South Wales. Now, if that's happened, you can't go back in time and change that New South Wales classification. You're going to have to work with it into the future. So you will have to continue using that overclassification as a starting point, unfortunately. So get it right with the modern award, but if you did have previous issues with it, you might be stuck with that classification for the time being, and that could end up in a situation whereby you need to have things manually classified for you, or to have a bit of a go yourself at that one. Move on to your industrial obligations and funding. I'll have a look at that. The Commonwealth has committed to fully fund its share of programs, both directly funded and jointly funded programs. The 8 years to phase in is to assist in unfunded programs as well as government budgeting. New South Wales has also committed to supplement state funded programs. Now, of course, what this looks like on the ground is something you have to deal with your individual funding bodies. Just have a look at how that supplementation came about. Pretty much there would have been two options in terms of working out supplementation. One was to come up with some kind of was to go through this process and come up with a summary of how to do it. The other was to go into your organisations and actually work out exactly who people were employing. Now certainly this one is more timely and probably the better option in terms of actually getting to the bottom of what's happening out there. So it's based on three components. The ER increase for applicable rates at SACS level 4. As you can see, that was only 0.78% for the transitional award rate for the 7 months. So it's lower because it was only for 7 months, not for 12 months. And it's also lower because it's talking about transitional rates, not the full modern award increases. It also takes into account the proportion of program funding allocated to SACS wages and the grant amount. Now you can see there's two variables there that could create problems for you. If you don't have the majority of your workers at a level 4, if you have them at a higher level, or if the proportion of your program funding allocated to SACS wages is higher than that 70%. Looking at it as an example, where we have a $100,000 grant, it's 0.78% times 70% times $100,000. So there you go, you're looking at a $546 increase for 2012 to 2013. So it's going to be higher next year because it's for a longer period. But that's just one example. Where what you need to be looking at is if you, for example, have a lot of SACS workers at level 5, that may cause problems, or if your SACS wages component is a lot higher. in those cases, that's what you need to be reporting back to your funding body, is that we're not working with a 70% wages component and the average of our workers isn't at level 4, it's at level 5, for example. Now, with the New South Wales supplementation is paid to funded organisations. So if you're unfunded, you're not going to get supplementation. Fax letters were sent out on 1 December 2012, so most people should have seen those. Again, amounts were based on a SACS on the award wages component of recurrent funding grants, and the wages component varied due to program characteristics, so somewhere between 42% and 70% in most cases. So again, the key factors are the same, the SACS wages proportion and the wage gap percentage. So if either of those things are different for your organisation, you need to be reporting that back to your funding bodies and letting them know what's happening. Again, the supplementation payable is calculated as follows: the grant amount times the SACS wages proportion times the wage gap. There were some conditions of payment. Organisations need to confirm that the funds will only be used for ERO-related wage increases. Any surplus supplementation is to be returned, and you need to confirm your agreement by 28th of February. If you haven't done so, as such, I suggest that you probably need to do that as soon as possible. There's certainly some issues there that if you have above award increases that you, for whatever reasons, whether they be due to having some sort of collective agreement or whether or not it's just something the organisation does as part of its general employment practice, you may still need to be providing increase on those wages, even though industrially you're not obliged. Your funding arrangements may oblige you to be paying those increases. So you need to have a look at how things are worded in contracts, what your collective agreement states, and also what your contract states about how that money is to be used. Certainly forward queries to your regional contract managers to have a chat with them about that if you need to. All right, are we in scope? Funding agencies provide supplementation to programs that are expected to employ SACS workers. There is no commitment to supplement where you're not industrially obliged. So if funding agencies aren't aware that you employ SACS workers, or if you're employing people as SACS workers who aren't in fact SACS workers, is where you might have a bit of a struggle. Where we have some award coverage issues, certainly are where we have perhaps children's services who should be employed under children's services and not under SACS. Those employees are not subject to the ERO. We also have the occasional one-off stuff, and some might be doing labour market assistance, aged care, nurses, health professionals. Those individuals are not going to be covered if they're covered by those awards. So where you happen to employ a nurse, they may well be under SACS. If you specifically have asked for a nurse and you are employing a nurse as a nurse, that person is not going to be covered by the SACS award. They're going to be covered by the nurses award, and they're not going to be subject to the ERO and not going to be getting that sort of funding. There are two main tests for coverage by industry awards. One is that the work within the industry is that the work is being done within the industry as defined by the award. So that's you as an organisation. What industry do you work in? The majority of you, I assume it's going to be SACS. And that puts you under that award. And then the work has to be covered by the classification definitions of that award. So this is why we have admin workers coming under SACS, is because even though their whole job isn't described by classification, their jobs can be described with certain classifications. So you don't need to be doing everything in the classification to be under that classification. You just need to be doing parts of it. And that's where your admin workers come in. If SCHADS does apply, we just need to ensure we're using the correct classification schedules. Home care and SACS are the big areas to be careful of around that. It's important to remember that home care is not subject to the ERO. Now, what do these industrial obligations mean to our funding? If you have insufficient funding, it's not going to be a defence to say that we were not funded, therefore we incorrectly paid someone. If you have SACS workers, they get the ERO, it's not going to be a defence to say you couldn't afford it. There's no discretion to underpay due to that funding. Your options really are to find other revenue or absorb by drawing on reserves, or reduce your wages bill through attrition or a structure. Employees are employed by your organisations, not the funding body. So the thing to be really careful about is it's fine to have something in a contract like the position is subject to funding, but the thing to remember is that person is still an employee, and it's not going to suffice just to say we've lost the funding, therefore there's no entitlement for that person. They may be subject to redundancies and all sorts of other things, so you just need to keep half an eye on that. Your employees are still your employees, and it's not going to do to pass on the responsibility of that to the funding body, because it's your responsibility as the employer. that's the end of our presentation for today. Certainly if you have any further questions, feel free to contact someone at NDS. Thank you.